Good afternoon, everyone who's joining us. We're going to start, but this live stream is being recorded, and you can always go back and watch the parts that you missed. My name is Ashkan Kazarian. I'm Senior Fellow at the Constitutionally Limited Government team at Stand Together Trust. I focus on free speech and civil liberties, and we have worked with Center for Democracy and Technology for many years and collaborated on both this eighth annual Future of Online Speech conference and many other projects. Let me tell you a little bit about Stand Together Trust. Our organization has worked for many years protecting freedom of speech and civil liberties, and that has been our focus. We have never wavered. When new technologies get introduced, there's always a new attempt with stronger focus to regulate speech, to invade our privacy, mostly by governments, but some other actors too, in that space. And we have to stay vigilant and constantly and tirelessly work to protect them. We live in an era where there's an increased toxic division and momentum across the political spectrum to stifle this discourse often ends up running into the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is strong in the United States of America, but it needs to be reinforced and needs to be protected. We can't lose the value and the importance of it because our society is, being shaped by new technologies. As a result, the work of Stand Together and our partners in defending the First Amendment and civil liberties, I believe, is more important than ever. And we have now encountered this new, not if medium, but at least mode technological development that has affected our lives, which is artificial intelligence. Now, when social media first came to the scene, it changed everything, and it changed how we communicate and changed our economy and changed our discourse about free speech. We're already seeing the artificial intelligence have similar effect. And in the year of 2024, we're having a critical election in the United States, and there are also many critical elections that have happened across the globe that have affected many democracies and also affected the way political discourse is being conducted in the United States. So all of that brought us to this topic of focusing on AI and elections and free speech. And I'm very excited for you to hear the rock star panelists that we have. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, and then turn it over to Kate. So first of all, as I said, we are being live streamed and recorded. If there are meetings or something you need to step away from, you can always come back. You can always go back and rewatch some of the great insights. If there are any questions, get them in early. We're trying to stay on a tight schedule. If you're joining us via Zoom, there's a Q&A feature. If you're watching on YouTube, live streaming on YouTube, you can tweet questions using hashtag FOSO2024. You can email questions to questions@cdt.org. And our Elizabeth Seeger, CDT's communications manager, is going to monitor all of his channels and pass them to the team. We're very delighted to welcome a broad audience today, and we would want to remind all the speakers and the audience in their questions to stay away from, tech policy or legal jargon and make this conversation as accessible as possible for all of those who are joining us. And we are going to run till 2:30 p.m. EST. And after that, if you haven't joined us yesterday, I encourage you to watch day one of FOSO. We had an incredible keynote by Renee DiResta and two incredible panels. My main takeaway from them was that elections are coming. Disinformation is happening. Campaigns sometimes are coordinated, sometimes are coordinated. Some of these are rumors, some of these are misinformation, some of these are disinformation campaigns. But at the same time, not all of it is depressing and bad. There are systems that we as a society have created. They're fact-checked. The companies and the industry are collaborating and working together to address these. And with this new mode of having generative AI be part of this conversation, we are not seeing anything extremely out of ordinary disrupt our ecosystem. At the same time, we're staying vigilant, and everyone in this ecosystem is very open to civil society and experts and academic feedback to reinforce the system. That was a very, very short recap. I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who can do a much better job than I did. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you so much, Ash. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the 8th annual Future of Speech Online, hosted by the Center for Democracy and Technology and Stand Together Trust. As Ash said, my name is Kate Rawan, and I am the director of CDT's Free Expression Project. CDT is a 30-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to protect users' civil rights, civil liberties, and democratic values in the digital age. I am delighted to welcome you to day 2 of our incredible event, where every year we tackle a major topic related to free expression online, as Ash talked about. And as she also talked about, for those who joined us yesterday, day 1 kicked off with an incredible slate of experts that you can go and watch online. First, we heard an important call to action from Renee DiResta, our keynote speaker. She has been at the forefront of the research and advocacy field that has been working tirelessly against the erosion of our shared reality. She explained that the challenges that we face as our realities fracture into separate silos, but she also reminded us that we are not without agency. We have the power to affect change. She urged us to use FOSO as an opportunity to learn about threats to free expression and our elections, to come to understand how those threats operate, and then take action to thwart them. We also heard from elections experts, disinformation experts, and fact checkers in both English and Spanish, who taught us about the importance of reliable information and building trust within communities by speaking their language and meeting them where they are. We heard that generative AI has so far not manifested as the major threat we have been so concerned about, though there have been worrying incidents. But even so, we also heard that both civil society and the companies remain vigilant and concerned about the possibility of last-minute uses of the technology that could have a profound impact. Finally, we also heard from some company stakeholders at Meta and Microsoft who discussed their efforts to protect elections, even as they are developing new technologies, how they seek to work together and even limit the use cases of their new services to reduce risk. All around, it was a fascinating discussion, and today we plan to build on it by first discussing what we're calling the infrastructure of truth, but might be better described as the infrastructure of trust. In our first panel today, we are going to talk with experts from the Wikimedia Foundation, Witness, and Internet Sans Frontières about how to build resilient and trustworthy spaces online without asking intermediaries to become the arbiters of truth. Then we'll turn to the courts. My colleague Becca Branham will lead legal experts from the National Coalition Against Censorship, the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia, and the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights Under Law in a discussion about recent court cases and their potential impacts on election-related speech and the legislative landscape going forward. Finally, we'll turn to the question of how we will be able to understand the upcoming election and the ways that the internet spaces that we all inhabit will influence it. Online spaces are critical for discussion and for organizing. One of the only ways to understand how these activities happen and how online talk might cross over into real-world action, even violence, is to be able to research it. But research or access to the data necessary to understand these events is under threat. In our final panel, Rose Jackson of the DFR Lab will talk with experts including Rebecca Tromble, Brandon Silverman, and Augustina Del Campo about the necessity of independent research, what is needed to support it, and how to protect researchers as they do their work. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited for the discussion. The stakes are tremendously high, but we have an opportunity to work together to ensure the protection of our most cherished rights. I'm looking forward to working with all of you to do so. Now, as Ash said, I'm going to repeat a couple of the housekeeping points for folks that have joined since then. So just as a heads up, we are recording and live streaming today's session on CDT's YouTube page. So if you have to pop out for another meeting, that's okay. You can always catch what you missed online. We're scheduled to go until 2:30 p.m. today, and our speaker schedules are tight. So we're going to do our best to stick to that schedule. If you have questions, get them in early. We're also taking audience questions throughout the session. If you're connecting through Zoom webinar, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. If you're following on the live stream, you can submit questions via email at questions@cdt.org or via Twitter using hashtag CDTquestions, hashtag FOSO2024, and @SendDemTech. CDT's communication manager, Elizabeth Seeger, will be monitoring these channels and will pass those questions to our team. We are delighted to welcome a broad audience today, and for that reason, we would remind all of our speakers and participants to try and keep our language as accessible and understandable as possible to allow non-experts to follow along more easily. Okay, here we go. On to our first panel, Infrastructure of Truth. With that, I think we have a couple minutes, but I will pass it to Beth Francesco.
Hi, thanks so much, Kate. And good afternoon, everybody. I want to say hello to our guests today who are joining from around the world. I'm Beth Francesco, and I'm honored to join you from the National Press Club Journalism Institute in Washington, D.C. Our nonprofit organization's mission is to power journalism in the public interest. And I feel so fortunate to speak with three experts today whose work also centers on the public's interest through civic engagement, free speech, and digital infrastructure, especially in a high-stakes year like this one. This year, as you know, more than 2 billion voters are expected to head to the polls in 60 elections worldwide, including our own U.S. presidential election and state and municipal races. And we've already seen how quickly disinformation campaigns can be designed to interrupt true civic discourse and keep it from spreading. So let's be clear, disinformation interferes with the right to vote. If voters' beliefs are founded in false or inaccurate information, people are unable to make electoral choices that truly reflect their values. That's why combating disinformation and lifting and amplifying reliable information is crucial to protecting our elections. In the US, courts, regulators, and lawmakers are all grappling with efforts to protect the integrity of elections while supporting voter access to authoritative election information. We must have the infrastructure and systems in place that foster accurate and reliable information that the public can trust. And those systems do exist for us to learn from. Wikipedia is one such system, calling itself the ground truth of the internet. And journalists and news organizations have historically been another trustworthy system. But burdensome regulation, smaller profit margins, and turmoil are creating barriers to the freedom of the press and to online dissent. Today, we're going to explore the markers of resilient information ecosystems designed to counter disinformation while championing free speech and civic discourse. For this, we are going to turn to our panelists, and we couldn't be in better hands. I'd like to introduce Julie Owano, who is the Executive Director of Internet Without Borders and an inaugural member of the Facebook Oversight Board. Julie's work focuses on creating channels of collaboration between different sets of actors on the internet. She is especially interested in using multi-stakeholder approaches to foster collaborations on issues related to online content moderation. Julie is also a member of the Global Partnership on AI, created by France and Canada, of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council for AI on Humanity, and its Council on the Connected World. She's also a member of UNESCO's ad hoc expert group on the recommendation of ethics of artificial intelligence, a member of the World Benchmarking Alliance's expert community on digital inclusion, and a civil society member of the Global Network Initiatives Board. Welcome, Julie. I'd also like to introduce Sam Gregory, an internationally recognized human rights advocate and technologist. As executive director of Witness, he leads their strategic plan to fortify the truth and champions their global team who support millions of people who are using video and technology for human rights. Such important work. Sam helps ensure that we're better prepared globally for deep fakes, synthetic media, and deceptive generative AI. He's an expert on innovations in preserving trust, authenticity, and evidence in an era of more and more complex audiovisual communication and deception. Sam has testified to U.S. House and Senate subcommittees addressing AI, deepfakes, and media transparency, and has spoken at TED on proactive human rights-based responses to deceptive AI. In 2018, he initiated Witness's Prepare, Don't Panic initiative around deepfakes and multimodal generative AI. His work has directly influenced platform policies, emerging technologies for trust, legislative efforts, and a public discussion of who and what to prioritize. Welcome, Sam. And let's also welcome Costanza Shuba Kania. With over 10 years of experience in public policy, disinformation, and international relations, Costanza is the anti-disinformation strategy lead at Wikimedia Foundation, the global nonprofit organization that operates Wikipedia and other free knowledge projects. Costanza has also founded and directs an independent think tank working on geopolitical trends and regulation in the digital era. Her mission is to improve our information ecosystem, working to promote free, trustworthy knowledge and to counter threats to democracy, human rights, and public trust. Costanza has co-hosted a research project that developed legislative and regulatory proposals for Italy and is a special editor for the Harvard Kennedy School's Misinformation Review, where she contributes on the latest developments and challenges in the field. As a professional journalist with a Master of Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School, she combines her editorial, social media, and new media skills with a deep understanding of political communication, information management, and public affairs. Thank you each so much for being here and for sharing your expertise with us today. We're so grateful. We're all here because we are concerned about disinformation and about ensuring people have access to reliable content, especially about elections. But it can be really difficult to tease out what's true and what's false. And comparatively, it's easy for motivated actors to characterize information that does not fit their own worldview as being false in some way. Julie, I hope that you could tell us a little bit about the bigger picture here. What are some of the things that we should be thinking about when we consider how to create safety, reliability, and accountability online without getting caught up in adjudicating a particular factual dispute?
Thank you so much, Beth. It's a great pleasure to be here. And of course, thank you to CDT and Stand Together for organizing and convening these very important discussions about free speech online. To respond to your question, I probably will help us remember the context, right? We're talking about an online environment where billions of content are published in a matter of a second, right? And among those billions of content, there is information that is factually untrue. There are deep fakes. There are a lot of very wrong and blatantly false things. And there are also questions, issues that are being discussed and that can be weaponized by bad actors to further create this assumption that, the internet is against one side or the internet is against those who really want to defend free speech. I'm thinking, for instance, here about a very famous, CEO of a platform that used to be called Twitter, and that is now becoming positioning sometimes himself as being, someone who is being the subject of a witch hunt, right? So, having set this context, I think it is important. It is urgent, even not even important anymore. It has become urgent for our online ecosystem to probably pause a little bit the huge amount of human and also financial investment that we have put in the past few years to go after each piece of false information. It is humanely exhausting. And it's probably from a philosophical or more systemic point of view, it's probably not the approach that has been always that has always been the most efficient. I sit on the Meta Oversight Board, which is one platform that we cannot criticize for not investing, probably not as enough as we would wish, but probably cannot be criticized as one platform that does not invest resources in making sure that its platform are free of disinformation and free of unsafe content. But yet we are still facing problem. Meta is still facing huge amount of problem on Threads platform, on Threads, Instagram, and Facebook. So where do we go from here? My assumption, and that's the reason why I joined the Oversight Board, I think that having having a public exercise such as the one that the Oversight Board offers, a public exercise in which a platform has to respond to questions about its moderation and its choices of moderation. A platform has to respond whether or not it would accept XYZ recommendation and how the said platform will implement XYZ recommendation, or why the platform will not implement XYZ implementation. I think that type of public exercise is one of the antidotes to the environment in which we are, which is, on the one hand, a lot of us are dissatisfied with what we think are not enough efforts because we probably don't have enough information about those efforts on the one hand. And on the other hand, we also have those who are saying, oh, there is a conspiracy against us. There is a conspiracy against our points of view. We should defend free speech. We are the ones defending free speech, to kind of not to appease, but maybe to set the record straight and say, these are very complex questions. These are very complex situations. There is none of us will get it right on their own. No, not a single platform can get it right on its own. A platform does need sometimes the expertise of people who, like me, come from civil society organization. I've led Internet Sans Frontières. We've done fact checking. It's very, very resource intensive, and we've decided not to do that anymore. But we are on the ground. But I also work on the board with people who have been thinking about these issues from a legal perspective, but are also working with journalists, working with people from around the world, because those the infrastructure, the architecture of these platforms requires this very important diversity of thought, diversity of perspective on a set of issues that are very complex. So I think for me, this is where the infrastructure part of the conversation is interesting, because how can we, maybe the fundamental question would be, how can we elevate ourselves from the very exhausting task of getting every single piece of content right, to a place where we are confident as a society, as a global online society, that yes, we can trust that this platform has the necessary infrastructure to ensure that I will feel safe. They might not get it right 100% of the time, but at least I will have information about what efforts they put in place to make sure that I feel the safest possible on the platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So I'm hearing transparency on the platform's behalf in their efforts, as well as needing to be open to the feedback that they're getting from people who are outside of the organization and can help build the trust. I mean, the thing we can't account for is human behavior, right? It's how people will respond even with the information that's apparent to them. Sam or Costanza, would you like to weigh in on that question of how we should be thinking about creating these safe, reliable systems without, getting caught up in debunking each factual dispute that comes up?
I can jump in and then I think one of the things we need to do is have a mindset shift as well, because we're placing a lot of emphasis here on how we debunk falsehood, right? And how do we challenge falsehood? And the fragility of that system at a global scale is incredibly apparent, right? And so when we talk about placing trust in platforms, we have to put that in the context of the backsliding on content moderation, the challenges of doing that have existed, and the challenges that are emerging from generative AI. And I think one of the things that certainly in Witness's work we're trying to do is to try and focus on how we're reinforcing the capacity of individuals and communities to create trustworthy information and to have the indices of trust carry with it over the internet and carry with it online and offline. And I think that is a really important part of the shift, is we have to think about infrastructure as being human infrastructure and technical infrastructure that is in support of credibility and trust and transparency, versus debunking infrastructure that is flawed and sadly probably is going to get even more under-resourced over time. And I think that sort of is one of the critical questions we've got to grapple with, is how to get the balance right between the two. We can't give up on the debunking infrastructure, but I totally agree with what Julia is describing. Like, it feels like, and as someone who works with fact checkers, that's a Sisyphean task. And the public perception of fact checkers is varied, even if the public perception of fact checks and the academic research shows that they actually do work, right? But it's a Sisyphean task to try and debunk falsehood and do it at a global scale.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on this too. This is such a good question. I'd love the framing on infrastructure, because it really, the design that we try to implement is a critical part of how the information ecosystem works, right? So it's not a secondary topic, but really the fundamental. And regarding fact checking, in a certain way, when we get to fact checking, we already have lost a little bit, right? So we need to work earlier, much earlier, in the context of how do we create the infrastructure, how do we promote a positive architecture of the information ecosystem. This could look like increasing capacity, like Sam was saying. And for example, for Wikipedia, for the Wikimedia Foundation, we think about increasing capacity of our volunteers. It can look like creating structures that are more conducive to create reliable information, maybe that rely more on sources and things like that. And certainly what Julie was saying about having a public exercise, kind of an external look at the structures, at the platforms, and the ways that we organize content online, it's really, really critical. So, yeah.
Well, along those lines, thinking about the infrastructure that supports resiliency, reliability, I think Wikipedia is that great example of the infrastructure. I think in previous conversations, thinking about it as kind of an antidote to disinformation, if you will. Costanzo, can you tell us a little bit, give us a peek behind the curtain? What's Wikipedia's secret and what lessons can we learn from it to bring its benefits to other platforms that maybe haven't had the same type of success?
Yeah, so an antidote to disinformation is a big claim, but we really do believe in this claim. And I really, first of all, let me say how happy I am to participate to this conversation and really thank the organizers. This is such a good framing of the conversation, and I think the idea of the infrastructures is really, really critical. The reason why we call Wikipedia an antidote to disinformation, and also we call it an infrastructure, is because both for the way that content is created on Wikipedia, maybe I'll say a little more about this and how the volunteers work, but also one way that people get in touch with Wikipedia every day is not just by accessing Wikipedia, but by coming in contact with Wikipedia data across each platform. So Wikipedia, for example, is used for fact checking in the main platform, is used as one of the main, if not the main, source of training data for LLMs. It is used, by search engines, by digital assistants, etc. So there are two components, right? What happens on the platform and what is the content and the work the volunteers do on the platform. And then there is also another question, which is how is that data reused and shared? And so we like to think about Wikipedia as both influencing and being influenced by the information ecosystem. Because in one way, we think that reliable information on Wikipedia is critical because, again, it has a ripple effect. On the other end, as most people will know, Wikipedia relies heavily on sources. One of the reasons why Wikipedia works so well is that volunteers really, each piece of content needs to be sourced and sourced by a source that has been deemed reliable by a community of volunteers. This means that Wikipedia can only be as reliable as the sources that are in the information ecosystem, right? So we really like to think about how we positively influence the rest of the ecosystem and support those sources and support the creation of those. Why Wikipedia is reliable, and I want to say, not every piece of content on Wikipedia is, it will stand the test of time, let's say, but the way that volunteers work has been, we have done, many research have been done on how volunteers work, and it usually gets to a point of understanding and a point of reliability. And this is because of the way volunteers work, not only in creating content, but also in creating their own policies, in creating sometimes coding, and creating the platform. And so, if you go on any Wikipedia article, you can look at the talk page next to it, and it will show the conversations that people have had with each other to come to a certain conclusion of why a piece of content is, what is the right way to portray a certain aspect. And that has a lot to do with transparency as well. And I think that's certainly something that other platforms could take. So to recap, the community-led model, I think it's something that definitely should be highlighted, that should be promoted, that should be protected. Volunteers work every day to develop the content, to create the content, to work with each other in communities. We as Wikimedia Foundation do not work on the content at all. This is only the work of volunteers. And so that is one component. And then there is an important component that I think is transparency. Everything on Wikipedia is transparent, every edit, every conversation, everything. We understand that that's not possible for each and every platform. We really have a radical transparency, but we think that it can be done better. And it needs, of course, to be a transparency that doesn't go in the way of privacy, but goes together with privacy. And then there is also this component of really relying on the sources. And we think this is going to be more and more important, especially in the age of AI. And so I think those components are maybe some of the critical aspects and why we think of it as an infrastructure.
Thank you so much for that insight. I'm wondering, Sam or Julie, would you like to follow up on any of Costanza's thoughts?
So if you allow me, I'll go ahead. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes. So first of all, Wikimedia is absolutely a source of inspiration. If I could share an empowerment. And for that, I would like to share the story of my 10-year-old who has become a Wikipedia contributor because he saw a page where he thought, the information was not accurate. So for me, this was I was preparing this panel and I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly what the center of what probably the new age in which our online ecosystem might be going to, an age in which, yes, we do need to rely on platforms, willingness, as Sam was rightly saying and reminding us, willingness and commitment to make sure that they are, tasked with the right resources to fight the humongous problems that we're facing already and will continue to face if nothing is done. But in addition to that, I truly believe that contributors, users, if you will, have a very central role to play that probably we ignore a little bit too much right now, because yes, most of us are evolving on platforms where you have the impression that things come to you in an automated manner, almost serendipitously, but not that much anymore. And so it might feel kind of overwhelming sometimes. And so having spaces where you are empowered you have the power to make a certain decision, to decide that, no, I don't want to see it. And I don't think that others, I think that others should have the ability to look further information for themselves. I think this is very important and powerful and speaks to the other challenge that we need to think about when we talk about infrastructure for truth. We need to reflect on how bad our education has become. I would say globally. I'm in France. There's a lot of where I've worked a lot, and where my organization is based. There's a lot of discussion about the education, the lack of investment, the decrease of investment in education, especially in an era where we're overflowed with information on the one hand. On the second hand, there are very real issues that we still need to deal with in our societies, right? We still have a lot of problems with sexism. We still have a lot of problems with racism. And these pre-existed before the platforms, of course, came with their, the magnifying mirror that makes a lie become, such huge that it leads to real world consequences. But it remains that the grain of these diseases exist in our society. So I think reflecting on infrastructure would require also to include some aspect of the offline world that we do not include so far. And these aspects relate to education. Of course, the younger generations are, I mean, I have them in mind, but even as adults, we should continue to educate ourselves. And of course, the other very societal and political questions that remains and that need to be addressed outside of technology. And for that, the contributor approach, the ability for citizens, because the user are people, real people who are citizens in their lives, the ability to discuss those, to disagree and find reconciliation at some point, hopefully, is something that I hope we will see a little bit more on different platforms.
Also, a huge fan of Wikipedia. I have not persuaded my children yet to become editors, but I would now set that as a challenge. Thank you, Julie. Sometime soon. Two elements strike me in this. One is reflecting on the challenges that human rights defenders and journalists, the witness, work with. We often think of it as like they're facing an escalating burden of proof. That there's this sort of skepticism about frontline documentation and accounts. And a lot of the responses are collaborative. It's doing collaborative OSINT work, it's doing collaborative visual verification. And I think although Wikimedia is often perceived as very textual, there's a lot to learn from the ability to think about multi-source and how we move that forward. And so it's very much what we see on the sort of front lines of human rights defense and journalism is it's kind of a weird escalating burden of proof that's being met by collaboration and by finding new ways to represent information and present it collaboratively. The other thing that I think is really important, and you touched on it, Costanza, it's that Wikipedia rely on this set of diverse sources. And so I feel very complicated about our title today because infrastructure of truth, because I imagine the Singaporean government and a range of governments around the world think about what they've created in terms of fake news laws as an infrastructure for truth, a way of getting accountability for truth in this sort of, dystopian world of online that they perceive where they have dissidents and oppositional voices. And so I think we need to think very carefully about how we sustain legally and financially and directly with the skills and the tools to this front line of journalism and human rights and civil society that creates information. And we can't separate it from the fact that there's a perception of what infrastructure of truth is that's very much around government legislation and fake news laws. And so really regrounding in that, like I know we're all thinking in those terms, but we've got to think 360 on this because we're seeing that applying and being applied at the same time.
Sam, such a good point on those perceptions, and I appreciate you raising that. And this conversation is so terrific. I want to just take a pause before we dive into our next question to encourage the audience. If you have any questions, it's important to get them in early so that we can make sure we get to them. And we will in just a few after we go through a couple more questions. We have many of the tools and the understanding necessary to structure our online environments in better ways, but technology advances so quickly and in ways that sometimes outpace our understanding or ability to immediately adapt. How are democratic actors like journalists, human rights defenders, and activists viewing those changes in the online environment caused by synthetic content?
Thank you. And thank you also to CDT for hosting this and for Stand Together. Really glad to be here. So this has been a significant focus of Witness's work within our Prepare, Don't Panic initiative is how do we proactively support those frontline defenders and journalists to not only counter at the front lines, like in a very direct way, but also have a voice on the infrastructure and the regulation, because I think we need to have both. So what's happening at the moment, and I, in the introduction to today, and I wasn't able to join yesterday, but it sounds like it was a really rich conversation about how we understand the impact of generative AI and AI on the elections and the information environment. And At Witness, we've been running trainings directly with journalists. We run a rapid response mechanism for suspected deepfakes. We're very deeply embedded in the landscape of how it's playing out. And I would say there's maybe three things that we're seeing that feel really important in terms of adaptation and needs. The first is to recognize that, the hype has not played out this year, and that's a good thing, right? Because there are more than enough challenges, but we've seen enough signals of the way this disrupts the information environment with both new ways to falsify information, new ways to cast doubt on real information, and how that relates to some of the gaps we've been talking about already. So thank goodness it's not played out. What feels like very important, I think it's really important in a space like one led by CDT and others, is the next 2 years are super critical on the technical infrastructure and policy perspective. So yes, we may have dodged a bullet, so to speak, on the kind of direct manifestations in many ways of explicitly misinforming or disinforming deepfakes or synthetic media, but that doesn't mean we can take our hands off what is, eyes off what is happening now. And I say explicitly disinforming and misinforming because I'm not referring there to non-consensual sexual deepfakes, where you have this explosion of content that is incredibly harmful and has risen at a velocity that is increasing. The two things we hear from frontline defenders, one is, or maybe three things, I'm going to add one on. One is a reflection that they see this very much in the platform context, right? The sense that on the one hand, that moderation will be not done as appropriately as they hoped, or they will not be contextualized, and also that they won't have voice and agency in platform decisions and decision making, right? So that's a constant from before being carried over into experiencing this. Then there is what we describe as a detection equity gap. And what I mean by that is when we talk to a frontline fact checker in Georgia or Ghana or Venezuela or some in the US, or a frontline journalist, that the tools are not widely available to them to detect synthetic content or to prove that real content is not synthetic. So just a couple of days ago in our deepfakes rapid response task force, we got a case from a major country having an election this year in which a vice presidential candidate claimed that real footage was fake and put the pressure on journalists and fact checkers to prove that it was real, right? And that's almost probably like 30% of the cases we see it. And so that's all about this kind of blurring lines and the technical inability to make good judgments on that. And that, even at the current volume, is challenging. Imagine that at 10 or 20x, right? Then suddenly you have this real challenge, additional pressure being placed on frontline journalists and human rights defenders to both discern what is real and also discern what is fake, right, or synthesized, right? And I think that's a really looming challenge because it layers on all the other challenges we have on journalists and media, right? The fake news laws, the capacity challenges, the distrust, right? Add in a technical dimension that ripples through all of those. The second thing, and this is an area where we've spent a lot of time working on, and many in the human rights field for over a decade, is around kind of how do we have better ways to have media transparency about the provenance of media, how it was structured and created, right? So you can understand in some sense the recipe of what is AI and what is human, and how is it all kind of mixed together in the media that we are consuming that will be increasingly complex and mediated between the two. The human rights defenders and journalists we work with come at that often with very clear perspectives around it, right? So one perspective would be, yes, that would be helpful, but who controls it, right? Will this perpetuate monopoly control over who gets to decide how this works? Yes, but will this be used for surveillance or in any way to tie into those fake news laws? Yes, but who will have access? Yes, but who will this shift the burden of proof and truth on? So there is this emerging infrastructure, and it's very much part of a lot of the proposals at a regulatory and legislative thing. It's, including in many of the proposals at a state and many of the state levels, say the recent California proposals for legislation, the US federal, the EU AI Act, to have these ways to discern, in essence, the recipe of AI in our media. And certainly from a witness point of view, we think this is important. We're going to need better media transparency to enable discernment that isn't centralized, right? So that I can make a decision whether I think it is complicated or concerning or deceptive that someone has used AI or that something was created in a certain way. But we have to do that in a way that reflects these core values that are human rights and civil rights values and are the reflections of the people who are the most compromised at the moment, as I said, around privacy, around access, around weaponization. So got a complex set of needs, but it's very grounded in existing rights issues and very grounded in existing concerns around platforms and monopoly control.
Costanza, I'd love for your reaction to Sam's statements here about the needs of frontline defenders.
Yeah, I think so there are multiple components to this. One thing that I think it's really important about what Sam was saying is, well, many points, but one is about really tracing the information and making sure that we have a way, and that we, put pressure also on the design of platforms and actors and others that are creating this, of course, in good faith, to have a traceability, and this goes with the thing that we were saying before about sources. So where does a piece of information comes from? And this is something we think about a lot also for what I said before, that Wikipedia is used as one of the main sources of training data for generative AI. So of course we want everybody to have free access to Wikipedia data. It will always be free. We'll never make a decision to not have it free. But we want to make sure that it's not used to create false content or content that goes in a direction that is inaccurate, right? So how do we do that? And I think really one part is this traceability. And then there is also a component of how do we really promote an information ecosystem that is able to have reliable information that can then kind of counter immediately, or have reliable information available when deep fakes or this type of synthetic media that might be put out for disinformation purposes. How do we check that? How do we check that in a way that it's not then a burden of proof only on the first line defenders, but how do we support them also to have this response?
Julie, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Beth. Weighing in very briefly to wholeheartedly agree with what you have just said, Constanza, and also what Sam was saying, and maybe put the emphasis on this idea that yes, tech is going to evolve, and tech does evolve very fast, very rapidly. And there is an emerging conversation about human rights and engineering, for instance, human rights and product, human rights, and so that we can go past the worry that the technology will evolve, because we will have, technology or technical teams, whether the platforms are, privately owned or, are public, rather focused on public interest, like the Wikimedia Foundation or any other form. But we will be confident that whoever will work on the technical advancement, on the innovation, will have the human rights understanding and lens, ethical human rights lens that is required to translate into the technique, the questions around, for instance, we're talking about deepfake. How can I, well, by definition, deepfake, especially porn deepfake, are non-consensual by definition. How can I embed this from a technical point of view? The principle will remain the same. It's probably the technicality that will be different, right? Or how can I ensure that people can transparently access, more information about a piece of content, whether it's generated artificially or humanly. These are questions that will remain the same always, no matter what the technology will become. And so maybe the focus should be in ensuring that we can translate these questions as we're building these tools. That's probably one emphasis that I wanted to offer.
I'm so grateful for you offering that framework of the question. Thank you so much, Julie. I'd love to follow up. We often talk about the dangers of synthetic content undermining truth. and the need to fortify ourselves against that risk. That's been top of mind for a while now. But it's also interesting to think about the ways in which synthetic content might be used to reveal truth, specifically in the form of satire. Sam, can you talk a little bit about those kinds of uses and what they could mean?
Yeah, I think, and this is going back to our words truth here and trying to think about, what truth telling means in a lot of contexts and how that plays out. And I remember, Julie, you and I think one of the first times we met was around a case of misinterpreted synthetic media, one of the early ones where a platform really couldn't understand that a piece of political content that to one person might appear disinforming was in fact satirical content, right? And this was a very crude video a number of years ago that was disinforming, was satire, but was perceived as misinforming or disinforming. And I think for many people, satire is a very powerful form of truth-telling. What the advent of generative AI, and I think we can see this in the US electoral context, has revealed is like, how do we draw the lines there and how do we do that in a way that is combined with media transparency? And what I mean by that is when you see how easy it is to create satirical and parodic media with text to image, increasingly will be with text to video or video to video. We can see it in all the mimetic communication that is happening at the moment around the presidential candidates in the US. How do we understand and navigate preserving that as a space for power and truth telling while knowing that it's incredibly susceptible, as we know already, to gaslighting and deception? And I think it's also really helpful, and we've done a lot of work on satire, to think of this also as really the sort of the gray area that reveals the need for things like media transparency, right? So media transparency underlying, say, ways to understand AI and human and how something was created can help us discern that something was created with satirical or parodic intent, or perhaps a neutral intent that is kind of sitting in the middle and is being misused as disinformation or misconstrued. And I think that's really important when we look at sort of both photorealistic deepfakes, which of course there are more and more of, and to some extent with the kind of metaphorical representation. I read a quote a couple of days ago from Brendan Nyhan, the political scientist, where he said, one of the most powerful things about these text-to-image generators is they turn, they allow you to create metaphorical representation really quickly, right? Just a sentence, and you can metaphorically represent a dilemma or a political concept. And so we're sort of struggling how to deal with this sort of explosion of that sort of metaphorical representation satire. And increasingly we'll struggle with the sort of photorealistic creation and how we navigate that. And that's when I think it becomes really important to have both these infrastructure of trust and of provenance and of media transparency, but also the collective sense making, right? Which can say, wait a second, that was, that is being designed to attack, right? And the way we discuss that and can analyze that online or in spaces like, similar to Wikimedia or Wikipedia seems incredibly important.
Thank you so much. We do have a question from the audience, part comment, part question from Adam. And Adam says, we know that authoritarians are building out an infrastructure of information manipulation, which allows them to amplify and accelerate discourse that's harmful to democracy, as Sam suggested. An increasingly complex and crowded information environment. Adam says he is interested in this idea of infrastructure of truth as we're shifting from reactive to proactive approaches. Adam wonders, as we're thinking about infrastructure, including some strategic alignment among actors like governments, funders, civil society, journalists, and others around the strategic goals, what should those goals look like? And do we want the infrastructure to help us more quickly understand what's happening in the information environment or to accelerate data sharing across regions? It seems like there's a lot of different directions that the purpose and goals could take. So I'd love to hear from each of you on your reaction to Adam's commentary. Julie, please, you can kick us off.
Thank you. That's such a great question, which allows to broaden a little bit some of the aspects that we discussed. So the framing that I wanted to bring also is maybe one of the main goal. Maybe we should identify the main goal, right? We are afraid that technology might disrupt or put an end to a democratic and quite liberal world, right? Whether it is in powerful democracies like the United States or like countries in the European Union, or whether it furthers like Adam was saying in his question, it furthers the authoritarian powers around the world. I think for me, the what would be very, very exciting would be how can we come together, right? Governments, civil society actors, and companies, etc., to ensure that we want tech to continue to support democracy. We've seen that technology is able to support democracy, and with the recent news, it's very easy to forget, the very incredible advancements that have happened in the past 10 to 15 years. I always like to say that personally, I probably wouldn't have the same voice that I have today if we were in a world where in which I grew up 25 or 30 years ago. So I think we should be clear on that. We want to make sure that that very important tool, communication tool, continues to push humanity to its best. How do we do that? And then we can set different types of goals. One of the big problems is the inequalities, right? Inequality in access to information, inequality in deciphering even that information. Hence the question of education, and whose role is it to do that education? Is it the role only of the governments? Is it only the role of platforms? We could learn lessons from COVID. What happened in COVID? In COVID, platforms and government official authorities collaborated to ensure that everybody could get access to information about the disease, to information about where to get medication or protection against the COVID. Could we envision that for fighting against disinformation, AI generated disinformation? I would love to see more programs such as these ones. Resources developed by different set of actors, governments and platforms, to ensure that people wherever they are, usually on these devices, most of the day, can make sure that they know where to find resources to interpret whatever they're receiving on their devices. That's one example. If the aim is to make sure that during the election season here in the United States, but globally, as we've seen, in 2024, there were a lot of dozens of elections around the world. If the aim is to prevent, the electoral process from being disrupted by false results, by false claims of victory or false claims of loss, how do we do that? But well, we need to partner with elections authorities. We need to partner with organizations that can reach to the last elector who is in the most remote village in I'm from Cameroon, in Cameroon, for instance. That for me would be the type of initiative that I would have hoped to see more. I don't think we have done that as much as we had in the past. I feel like maybe on the end of platforms, there is less appetite to do what we've been doing in COVID. Maybe on the part of governments, there is more appetite to make sure that the companies can take down content that we think as governments are false. As civil society organizations, there is less appetite to do a lot of work that is sometimes co-opted without any form of recognition. That's also reality. So it's important for this different set of actors, stakeholder, in a multi-stakeholder fashion, to sit down and to reaffirm what is the goal that we want to achieve together, and how do we change what's not working now, or how do we envision what could work much better in the future. So it's a broad response, but I guess the goal is way too important to leave, just focus on one. We cannot have, unfortunately, anymore the power only to focus on one issue. The problems are so huge and are going to become huge that we do need to have a more systemic approach. Hence the importance of this discussion.
Julie, you have just wonderfully wrapped up our conversation. And thank you so much, because I think you hit on those key points of coming together and identifying among multiple stakeholders the key core, issues that we're trying to address as we look at the infrastructure of truth. We're right at time, and we just want to make sure we say thank you to Costanza, Julie, and Sam for sharing your insights and leading off the second day of FOSO conversations today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you, Julie, Sam, and Costanza, for a fascinating discussion. I am now going to kick it over to my colleague, Becca Branham, who is going to lead our second panel of Free Speech on the Ballot. Becca?
Thanks, Kate, and thanks everyone for joining us today for this Free Speech on the Ballot panel. Today we'll be discussing the online speech questions that the Supreme Court, Ninth Circuit, and other courts have been tackling recently, and how they'll shape how companies interact with governments and elections experts to make sure that trustworthy information about the election is available to people who need it. To talk about that and more, I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel, including Alexander Adbo, who is the inaugural litigation director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University, where he is involved in the conception and litigation of most of the Institute's legal challenges. Prior to joining the Knight Institute, Alex worked for 8 years at the ACLU, focusing on litigation relating to NSA surveillance, encryption, anonymous speech online, and government transparency. Next, we have David Brody, who is the director of the Digital Justice Initiative at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where he focuses on issues related to the intersection of technology and racial justice, such as consumer privacy, algorithmic bias, election disinformation, free speech, online hate group activity, content moderation, and government surveillance. David launched the Digital Justice Initiative at Lawyers Committee in 2019 and previously served in the Wireline Competition Bureau at the FCC. Last but certainly not least, we have Lee Rowland, who is a lifelong free speech advocate and the executive director of the National Coalition Against Censorship. Lee has extensive experience as a litigator, lobbyist, and public speaker. As an ACLU attorney, she served as the lead counsel in federal First Amendment cases involving public employee speech rights, the First Amendment rights of community advocates, and government regulation of digital speech. She recently served as policy director of the ACLU of New York, where she ran the civil rights organization's lobbying and public advocacy work. I'm thrilled to be joined by the three of them and really look forward to what I hope will be a conversation among them about some of the pressing issues in elections and what the courts have been saying lately about how the First Amendment intersects with that. So maybe we can start with Murthy versus Missouri. For those of you who aren't familiar, in Murthy versus Missouri, the Supreme Court was asked to consider the limits that the First Amendment places on what's commonly referred to as jawboning. In the run-up to the 2020 and 2022 elections, and throughout the pandemic, White House and other administration officials communicated pretty extensively with social media platforms about their content moderation policies in an effort to address election and COVID-19 misinformation. 2 states and 5 social media users sued, alleging that those communications were efforts to censor their speech in violation of the First Amendment. The case was dismissed on standing ground, but nevertheless, I think it raises important questions about censorship, challenges to combating misinformation, and individuals' rights to access information. So a broad question to kick us off, and I'm curious for your thoughts on the Murthy decision and how you expect the decision and congressional backlash to administration efforts to address election misinformation to impact efforts to improve discourse and address misinformation leading up to the 2024 election.
I'm happy to take first crack, Becca, but I will necessarily only touch a tiny slice of that, like, kind of huge and philosophical question that I think we'll hopefully dig into throughout the conversation. I think that of the panelists here and of lots of free speech groups who weighed in, the National Coalition Against Censorship, we filed a brief alongside FIRE, made, I think, one of the more libertarian arguments, kind of, I think when we're talking about free speech and election, there really are some philosophical differences in how you view the speech environment, right? Whether you take a more libertarian and kind of clinically anti-government, involvement approach, or whether it's a more human rights-based framework where we're actually talking about the information environment and people's right to speak and censor. And of course, all of those questions are, crammed together in this roiling, bundle in the internet age, right? Because we're actually talking about communication via private companies at scale. And even the justices don't even know, right, if that's censorship sometimes. And Murthy, I think, really gets at the facts in Murthy and what happened in Murthy, I think really get at this division and how we really look at the interplay between large corporate actors that are in fact massive gatekeepers, right, for conversations, including election related conversations, and the government's power and collaboration with them. And although you noted rightly, this was a standing case, but, it has implications. I'm going to risk kicking us off with an oversimplification, which is, I think the standing decision here is what troubles me on the merits in large part. And look, I would not have called this a pristine record. I would not have called the Fifth Circuit's underlying, decision a beautiful job of melding facts and law. But what was unquestionably clear in the facts of the case is that the government and the social media companies, particularly the big ones, Meta, were hand in glove. They were repeatedly meeting about the disinformation 12 or whomever, the hot list of COVID and anti-vax misinformation peddlers in the government's view. And there was, in a sense, I think, an informal full collaboration between the two, including the government flagging information that was obviously constitutionally protected and using that close relationship with Meta in particular to get these posts taken down. And I think that the standing decision really does miss some of the forest for the trees, or at least philosophically, we have to ask ourselves, do we care, right, that the wrong plaintiffs, right, were here, which are the people who were censored? And if the right plaintiffs are only going to be the company that feels jawboned, we have to acknowledge that that means that consensual cooperation between the government and massive corporations that gatekeep in practice our current, media for expression is fully constitutional under that rubric. They have given us, I think, in the decision by punting, no real help in determining the difference between persuasion and coercion in the classical test. But what we are for under Bantam books for coercion, but what we argued in our brief is that that itself leaves on the table an entire world of speech where the companies are the happy handmaidens, right, of the government's attempts to get rid of constitutionally protected speech. And so I think whatever you think of Murthy, I would challenge everyone to think about it in a truly nonpartisan way, which I think the plaintiffs in here emphatically did not, by the way. But the idea that we are coming up into an election cycle where the degree of the executive branch's control and ability to influence the speech moderation, the content moderation and speech environment depends on how close their relationship are and how welcome they are by these companies. And Meta may welcome in the Biden administration with open arms, and the X corporation may not. And that might be exactly different if the administration, the executive branch were a different party, or the legislative branch were a different party. So I think it really raises this question of, do we want our government to be able to consensually have tools and power to limit constitutionally protected speech when the governments that was a real Freudian slip, when the companies that control our access to those information environments are happy to do it. And yes, I think setting a clearer line between coercion and persuasion by the government is really important. But even beyond that, we are leaving a lot of mischief on the table for corporations who are happy to kind of be handmaidens of the government censorship to do that here. And that really troubles us. And I know not everyone in the free speech environment shared that view because it was not the only jawboning case, and I'm sure we'll get to it. But a lot of folks weighed in on the NRA v. Volo case, which involved the New York AG pressuring companies out of doing business with the NRA who didn't weigh in this case, in the Murthy case. And I'm really interested by that. And I'm interested in the philosophy of free speech folks who think it should be protected for the government as long as the companies are willing to manage our speech environment, including, constitutionally protected speech. That sets me off wrong, but it's not a universally held belief among free speech experts.
So I think Lee makes some really interesting points here that really gets at like a key distinction, but I want to take issue with a little bit of it. So let me unpack that a little bit. I think it's extremely important that we recognize that while there are important free speech interests on these platforms, there are zero First Amendment rights on these platforms, right? These are private companies that can make whatever rules they want for how people engage, as long as they're not running afoul of other types of laws like civil rights laws or consumer protection laws or what have you. But in terms of speech, if Mark Zuckerberg wakes up tomorrow and wants to ban anyone from mentioning the New York Yankees, he can do that. That's his right as the proprietor of a private venue, not a private venue, but a privately owned venue. But there are these hugely important free speech concerns that I think is what we're really getting at here. What I want to take issue with is I don't agree that the factual record in Murphy establishes that there was this level of hand in glove or concerted relationship between the federal government and the platforms. I think there is, first off, I'm not sure we actually got to a factual determination in the case to adjudicate that. So we have to be very careful about how we posit it. But I do think there is plenty of examples and evidence where, sometimes the Biden administration flagged things to the platforms and they said, no, that doesn't violate our rules. We're not going to touch that. So there's a very big difference between the government twisting the arm of a platform to make them do something versus a platform having a set of rules about what types of content are allowed, what types of activities are allowed, and allowing the government, like anyone else, to flag violations of it to them. There's nothing constitutionally problematic with the government saying, hey, we saw that such and such is a violation of your rules. Now, again, like the Murphy court didn't quite get to where's that line between reporting violations, having ongoing relationships, and arm twisting. But it still needs to be recognized that, just because the government tells a platform, hey, these guys are spreading disinformation, misinformation, what have you, and we think it's violating the rules, that's not a constitutional problem. But, there are a lot of concerns about applying and overstretching First Amendment principles to these platforms when they are not state actors. And in particular, there's a huge threat of mis and disinformation related to elections and other subjects, as other panelists have talked about. And these platforms play a vital role in keeping that in check and ensuring that we have a healthy information ecosystem. If some platforms want to choose to be free-for-alls, that's their right. But it's helpful when there are platforms that are not allowing disinformation to run rampant, particularly when that disinformation gets targeted at voters, especially, the examples that we have show that it's disproportionately targeted at Black voters and other voters of color, at speakers of non-English languages. Recently there was a appeal in United States v. Mackey in the Second Circuit. It's pending. This guy, Mackey, was convicted of sending voter intimidation messages through Twitter in 2016. He spread misinformation that you could text your vote, and this was found to violate voting rights laws. Similarly, in 2020, there was a situation in which a group of bad actors sent voter intimidation robocalls targeted to Black voters in 5 different states. They include misinformation about what would happen if they voted by mail. And that too was held to violate the Voting Rights Act. So, I think we have to think carefully about how we want platforms to be writing and engaging their rules and engaging with the federal government in terms of allowing things to be flagged. But the federal government also plays a really valuable role here, as we've seen with the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, which has primary responsibility for monitoring for foreign election interference threats and conveying that information to platforms. Just yesterday, Facebook decided to ban RT, which had been reported to be a Russian propaganda outfit. That's Facebook's right, and the intelligence that they're acting on comes from the federal government.
I think, can I jump in? Sorry, can I jump in, Becca? So it's a delight to be here. Always great to talk to Lee and David. I used to work with Lee, and Lee was my clinic leader back in law school. So I feel like I've had several decades of learning from Lee. I think one of the really challenging aspects of job owning doctrine is that the First Amendment actually protects the right of Facebook to agree with the government. And that's why the coercion persuasion line is not just a line for determining in a unidirectional way whether the First Amendment is engaged, but it actually divides the world of First Amendment rights on both sides. Coercion violates the right of people to speak when it's a government acting, but persuasion as a line protects the right of private individuals to be persuaded by the government. And so it is not, at least to my mind, unconstitutional for there to be what Lee characterized as collaboration, but what I might characterize as something that falls short of coercion. But and for that reason, I think the court actually got it right in Murphy. I wish the court had given us, more guidance on what the line was between coercion and persuasion. But even though I think the court got it right, I still share a lot of Lee's concerns. Let me just, articulate a couple of them. One is I agree that it shouldn't be the case that somebody could be successfully job owned and then denied standing in a case because they couldn't actually get forward-looking relief, which is one of the things the Supreme Court said. Now, I actually think the Supreme Court's standing decision, as is often the case in First Amendment cases, was a tacit merits decision. There wasn't standing because the court didn't think they had shown a direct connection between the alleged coercion and any act of censorship of these particular plaintiffs. But suppose they had demonstrated that connection, another part of the court's logic would have kicked in, and these plaintiffs couldn't have gone forward because there's no relief they could have gotten. The alleged coercion took place years ago. Policies at Facebook have changed. In the meantime, Facebook has an absolute right to decide whether to change those policies, and it would actually be a First Amendment problem, a separate First Amendment problem, to force Facebook to put them back on if Facebook didn't want to put them back on. All of that, to my mind, speaks to the need for a kind of damages remedy relating to government coercion. But this is the same Supreme Court that has systematically gutted the availability of damages causes of actions for demonstrated constitutional violations. I think that would go some way, though, if we had a damages remedy to preventing the real problem that I agree with Lee about, that it shouldn't be the case that somebody could successfully allege coercion but not be able to seek a remedy. I don't think that was the case in this case, but the logic of the Supreme Court's opinion certainly contemplates that it might be the case in the future. Beyond that, I think a lot of the concerns that I share with Lee are ones that derive from the concentration of power that these private platforms wield over public discourse. And if it were not for that concentration of power, then I think we would all be a lot less concerned about where exactly the line is between coercion and persuasion, because the government talks to private speakers all the time. And the First Amendment community as a general matter is not up in arms screaming every time the government, for example, calls up the New York Times and said, "You misquoted me." Now, the misquote was probably constitutionally protected. It probably didn't rise to the level of actual malice. And yet there they are trying to suppress constitutionally protected speech by getting a correction in the New York Times. The First Amendment community is as a general matter, not up in arms, complaining about that, because the New York Times has a right to hear what the government has to say and to decide whether it's persuaded, so long as it is insulated from coercion. What makes it different, though, in the social media context is, I think, the core concern that Lee was really getting at is that there's this perception that these companies are willing to be the handmaidens of government. And that's in part because they are so large, such obvious targets for regulatory authority, and they benefit enormously from having a relatively smooth relationship with the government, and they don't really care about any individual post on their sites. Very different than the New York Times, right? The New York Times cares a lot. Most media outlets care a lot about any individual article they publish. They agonize over every word. That is not Mark Zuckerberg, right? Facebook, gives they don't care, all that much about any individual post, and so their incentives are aligned against, or at least not sufficiently aligned with, the free speech interests of their users. And so, one thing that we argued in our amicus brief was the Supreme Court shouldn't expect job owning doctrine to solve the problem of concentration. And I think it would be a mistake to distort job owning doctrine to do so, in part because I don't think you could distort it enough to solve the problem of concentration. There'll be all sorts of collateral consequences for other circumstances where nobody questions the legitimacy of the government engaging with private actors. When the government, when government scientists talk to private researchers and they say, actually, we disagree with your analysis of your data, and the private researcher is convinced, would we say I don't think we would say that's coercion, but it, nominally looks very similar to what was going on when, say, the CDC was asked by Facebook, is this potential disinformation about the COVID vaccine actual disinformation? Facebook then could decide whether they were going to take it down as a result of what the CDC said, but it was ultimately their choice. But again, all of which is to say, I think concentration is the core problem. And if we addressed concentration head on, I think there'd be a lot less pressure on job owning doctrine to help sort out coercion from persuasion.
I actually totally agree with that, Alex, and guilty as charged. Like, I know those are the values that are coming out because what we're talking about is government cooperation for setting speech norms, policies, right? It's not a one-off misquote. It's not a, to your point, David, about the kind of election regulation environment, it's not an objective, verifiable fact, right? I mean, they're not in existing buckets where we can kind of deal with them with our existing, First Amendment doctrine. We are talking about setting rules for content moderation and speech at scale. So I absolutely plead guilty as charged that when I'm thinking about the government's role here, my concern is massively heightened because it is de facto in some cases, like, becomes a speech environment where the government can heavily influence that. And I think it's tough for me to actually posit a enforceable rule that would apply to kind of government communications that would apply to the misquote and the speech. I get it. Like, it is a scale, and how you slice that off, I don't know. Obviously, I think there are echoes of antitrust, right? And how we think about monopolies and that speech environment. But it might be helpful at this point to kind of point to the practical outcome here, which I think shows a very bright light. I have never in my life complimented the FBI as being a leading light in civil rights or free speech or anything else, but here, in the aftermath of the case, the FBI put out new guidance about how they would reach out to social media companies. And that guy, I don't think I can access the chat, but it's easy to find if folks want to. And the FBI's guidance emphasizes transparency and voluntariness. That is, that every request to a social media company will be made transparent. And in it, and who knows how much of it is semantic, right, given the massive scales and context we're talking about, but it falls all over itself to say, this is persuasive, not coercive, right? So we kind of see the language of, the still unanswered question, I think, in the wake of Bantam and in the wake of, in the Murthy cases, that the FBI is at least setting forward a model where transparency at least would seem to be a pretty clear gap between the coercion and persuasion. And I do think that at heart, it's interesting, the Institute for Free Speech, I hope I'm getting this right, filed a brief that basically wanted a bright line rule that anytime the government wanted to request that constitutionally protected speech be amended, wanted to flag it, wanted to legally snitch, right, pursuant to their existing policies, that the only way they could do it without a presumption of coercion would be to do it publicly, transparently, it be on the record, and the request was, but that whenever it occurred behind closed doors, and there was the even suggestion of a hand in glove relationship, that the presumption is that it was coercive, absent another proof. We didn't quite go that far in our test, but I think no matter where the free speech organizations weighed in and suggested different tests, the practical application by the FBI, I think, would satisfy most people. That I think the real trouble for me is these behind closed doors meetings. And David, you're right. There were times where they said, hey, that speech was already on our list. We got it. There were other times it was, hey, you missed this, but we're snitching pursuant to your existing policies. But I think the most troubling for me is that record, and I agree totally, I'd love to have a better record there, indicated an entitlement on the part of the federal government to have repeat meetings, to get pissy when they didn't get responses. And I think if you work for a heavily regulated company, it is very, very difficult to actually assess how coercive that is in the context of the regulatory environment. And by the way, Section 230 was raised a few times, like, oh, nice company, shame if anything happened to it. And all of those shenanigans are enabled by the access, by the non-transparent access that those companies and the governments enjoy together. So I think, just to, give the FBI a compliment, I suspect will never happen again. They have created a guidance that at least straightforwardly makes it transparent, voluntary, and at least eliminates the paranoia, right? That this repeat access is effectively our government jawboning the speech environment.
So
Yeah, go ahead, David.
I agree with a lot of this. I will take issue that these companies are heavily regulated in terms of the social media platform. But I think it's a very complicated environment when you're talking about the intersection of the government and some of these companies and other private actors, especially around elections. So just to give an example, tell a little bit about what we do at Lawyers Committee. So at Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, we convene the Election Protection Coalition, which is the largest nonpartisan voter protection network in the country. And for anyone listening at home, the hotline number is 866-OUR-VOTE. If you have any issues with voting, please call us. But one of the things that election protection does is we do have ongoing relationships with both the social media companies and with federal agencies that are in charge of protecting election integrity, like DOJ and CISA and other folks like that. And that trilateral relationship involves information sharing that needs to be kept confidential. Sometimes we're talking about threats to election officials and election workers. Sometimes we're talking about chatter about voter intimidation or things like that, where there needs to be able to be an information exchange that is not public. Because if it gets highlighted in a public way, it can actually put people at risk or amplify disinformation or other harmful things in a manner that is counterproductive to addressing those threats to voting rights.
Can I just say two quick things?
Yep.
So one is, but I should have been more precise, David, when I said heavily regulated. What I mean is that the platforms are heavily regulated in the sense that they rely entirely on a federal statute for the viability of their business model. Without Section 230, they couldn't exist in their current form, and they have an interest in making sure that that statute stays more or less the way it is.
Sure, but the White House can't affect that, right? Like,
no, I mean,
the executive branch can't threaten, like, hey, we're going to make the legislative branch pass a law.
I don't think Biden saying, we should consider Section 230 reform should be understood to be coercive within the meaning of job owning doctrine. Nor do I think we should understand Biden saying the platforms are killing people to be coercive within the meaning of that doctrine. We did actually in our brief point to an example of an exchange along the lines of what Lee was referring to a minute ago that we thought satisfied the coercion test. The Supreme Court, I think, was probably right that even that example wasn't connected to actual censorship, but the browbeating to us seemed to reach the level of coercion. But the other quick point I would make is just I want to agree with Lee about the FBI guidance, which I think is very, very good in terms of the message it signals around FBI input to social media companies about quote unquote foreign malign influence. I do take issue with this phrase. I don't know if folks have studied the FBI's definition of the phrase foreign malign influence. On its face, it seems directed at the idea that we don't want foreign states trying to, subversively or coercively influence our elections. But the definition is written so broadly that it would seem to cover a non-state foreigner, so say a citizen of the EU, who is complaining in an op-ed in the, ghostwritten in the New York Times about the breadth of NSA surveillance because it allows the NSA to spy on, virtually anybody in the EU. I don't think the FBI should have as its mission the suppression of that kind of speech. So just one minor quibble in the other direction with the FBI's new guidance.
No, that's really helpful. I think maybe we could pivot from there, both to regulation and transparency. So the Ninth Circuit has been busy. In August and September, they issued two decisions, NetChoice versus Bonta and X versus Bonta, which build on the Supreme Court's recent decision in Moody versus NetChoice, that speak to both the regulation of platforms, but also transparency on platforms, and will have major implications for online speech and transparency. Specifically in the X versus Bonta case, the court struck down parts of the California law that mandated transparency regarding platforms' policies for addressing extremism, disinformation, and foreign political influence, among other topics on their platforms. At CDT, we care a lot about transparency, and we often think of transparency and sunlight as the best disinfectant. And in other areas, in the political speech lineage of cases, for example, the Supreme Court has upheld different kinds of transparency requirements. But the Ninth Circuit said the ones that the California legislature enacted couldn't pass muster under the First Amendment. So I'm curious for your thoughts on what X versus Bonta means, and also Moody versus NetChoice means for the future of transparency related to elections and elections-related speech, and to what extent do you think that the political speech lineage of cases is relevant to how we should understand and evaluate transparency requirements for platforms?
Sure. So let me kick it off there. So I have a lot of concerns about the breadth of the Ninth Circuit decisions. And part of that, is that I think the Supreme Court made a very astute point in the NetChoice v. Moody, NetChoice v. Paxton cases, where it said that the lower courts need to slice and dice these laws with particularity. Some provisions may be facially unconstitutional. Some provisions are facially constitutional. Some provisions may be unconstitutional as applied, but you need to wait until you have facts that give rise to that application. And my concern with the Ninth Circuit decisions is that they are painting with a broad brush. There are certainly some potential speech issues with some of the state laws that are, seeking to try to regulate like what content kids can see online, or there's also some First Amendment questions around age verification, things like that. But when those statutes have basic privacy and transparency provisions in them, those are things that we have upheld as constitutional for decades. And so when the Ninth Circuit says that it's going to, in these cases, it took a very, very, very narrow view of what constitutes commercial speech versus other forms of speech. And as folks probably know, commercial speech gets less protection under the First Amendment, and it's easier to regulate it. And the Ninth Circuit basically said, we're going to take this very narrow view, and the types of transparency disclosures that some of these statutes are requiring, the privacy protections that these statutes require, don't rise to that level. And the consequence of this is that it threatens privacy laws generally and consumer protection laws generally, if we are going to start weaponizing the First Amendment to say anytime we require a disclosure from a corporate actor that that's going to be compelled speech, or anytime we impose a burden on data collection or data use practices, that's going to be some sort of prior restraint. That's not how consumer protection law has functioned for decades, and it jeopardizes lots of long-standing laws like HIPAA and the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act and GLBA and other basic consumer protection statutes. Not even just in the privacy context, but think about like the SEC requiring various transparency disclosures of publicly traded companies, and the FDA requiring certain disclosures on food labeling and medicines. It gets really problematic when you start saying that these types of basic privacy and transparency provisions are unconstitutional compelled speech.
I think I agree with all the values you set out, David. I don't think that risk is present here. And I think there are some cases where I think I've been troubled by that line. This isn't one of them to me. And I think it is because, I mentioned before when we briefly touched on commercial speech that, under the Zauderer line of cases, commercial speech generally has to deal with, or compelled commercial speech, with a kind of objective, presentable fact. And I think when you are talking about content moderation decisions, that there is a very real tension between editorial judgment and disclosure. And I do think, I think there are ways to apply consumer protection laws to speech entities. That is, I don't think there should be a speech exceptionalism, right? You claim that you go online and you post a blog and all of a sudden you get some exception from consumer. I don't think that's the case. But when I think the law itself categorizes based on the content of that speech, rather than the mechanisms by which, the company protects data, you're squarely in, the idea of we require all newspapers to disclose their, how they pick their op-eds, their editorial judgment. And I think that is a tension that we should recognize and welcome as First Amendment advocates, that it doesn't, we're not just in normal consumer protection land, that the government is getting into subjectivity, the subjectivity of editorial choice. And frankly, I see claiming this as a consumer protection somewhat of a bit of a smokescreen for the government to claim that's what it cares about, when if you just read the face of the law, the entire law is anchored on 6 different types of content, right? Hate speech, misinformation, also known as constitutionally protected categories of speech. So I think that AB 587, frankly, was doomed from the get-go, because the way it was drafted belied the fact that its drafters, what they were truly concerned about was a mechanism for the government to be investigating whether social media companies were allowing hate speech. They weren't fundamentally concerned, I don't think, and I think the statute text belies that, with basic data practices and protecting minors from data practices. You don't need to know those categories of information to do so. So I think this case, this law, this bill deserved the opinion it got, because I see the California Age Appropriate Design Code as fundamentally about content. And I do not think that a law like that should benefit from the general Zauderer, the very deferential Zauderer thing, when it's drafted as something we're concerned about your content, but we're going to claim it's about data and your moderation policies. No, there are different ways to draft that law that don't start anchored on here are the 6 categories of content we'd really like to know what you guys are doing with. So I don't see the decision as a threat to the Zauderer case line at all. I see it more akin to the recognition that we have not used generic antitrust, monopoly, consumer protection laws to regulate, for example, newspapers. And I think that is a healthy tension, not a new line of doctrine that's going to swallow consumer protection law.
I think I agree with a lot of what both David and Lee said. So let me start with the net choice case in the Supreme Court. I think it was good for the Supreme Court, right for the Supreme Court, to recognize that Zauderer has some applicability even in the context of entities that are engaged in significant expressive decision making. And this was a fight all the way up to the Supreme Court, with the free speech community a bit split. And maybe saying it was split is really over generous to the Knight Institute. I think the Knight Institute was the only free speech organization arguing that Zauderer had any application to the individualized explanation provisions that the Supreme Court took up in that case. I can think of a few other amicus briefs that suggested that Zauderer was categorically inapplicable in the context of editorial decision making. And I think the court was right. Now, it was not a reasoned explanation. There was no reasoned explanation from the Supreme Court as to why exactly Zauderer is the right framework for analyzing those individualized explanation requirements in the Texas and Florida laws that were being considered. And there's a good argument, as the dissent said, that, or maybe it was really a concurrence, that was all dicta and will have to be considered again once the case gets back up to the Supreme Court. But still, I think 8 of 9 justices suggested that Zauder was the right framework, and I think that was an important recognition that Zauder can do some real work. When it comes to X versus Bonta, I'm kind of two minds about the significance of the case. On the one hand, it's not at all clear to me that the case will have any significant impact when it comes to what I think of as the most fruitful avenues for transparency litigation, because I think both laws, AB 587 and the Age-Appropriate Design Code Act, both ran pretty headlong into the most challenging doctrinal questions around transparency laws. Along the lines of what Lee was saying, neither one is like, neither, for example, was at all like the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act being considered by Congress, which was about mostly enabling research through transparency disclosures by the platforms, rather than requiring the platforms themselves to explain, something about, for example, in the context of the Age-Appropriate Design Code Act, vague and undefined categories of constitutionally protected speech that is, could be of material detriment to minors. So I'm a little bit, it's not entirely clear to me that the cases will have significant impact beyond this narrow category of transparency laws. On the other hand, even though I think I agreed with the outcome in Net Choices versus Bonta, I have some questions about the outcome in X versus Bonta. But setting aside, my views on the outcome, I think the analyses in the cases were probably overbroad. For one thing, it's not at all, the court in both cases went out of its way to articulate a fairly narrow vision of what Zauder is about. And I don't think that narrow vision was necessary for the court to reach the outcome it reached in either case. And the vision it articulated, I think, was actually inconsistent with the premise of the Net Choice decision in the Supreme Court that Zauder might apply to an individualized explanation requirement. And so I do worry about how narrowly it construed Zauder. I also don't think Zauder should at all have been at play in the consideration of the data privacy impact assessments in the Age-Appropriate Design Code Act, because those impact assessments were meant to be disclosed under a promise of legal confidentiality to the state, to the Attorney General, I believe. And Zauder is about making sure consumers have the information they need to understand commercial products and services. And so I don't think that case should have been about Zauder at all. I don't know why the court went out of its way to describe Zauder very narrowly. But anyway, so that's kind of how I think about this. I think there's still plenty of room for transparency regulation. I hope the kind of transparency regulation we see has less to do with content moderation policies and rationales than it does with data necessary to enable independent research, which I think is going to be a lot more important to the public in understanding these platforms and to regulators in coming up with, reasonable content neutral regulations to the extent there are any that, seem obvious after we better understand these platforms.
Yeah, I largely agree with Alex, and just to highlight why I think I agree that I think on the merits in terms of like the right outcome was basically reached in these cases for the most part in terms of like the way in which these underlying statutes had speech content issues. My concern, though, is that the court, the Ninth Circuit in these cases, seems to be focusing on too much, in my mind, on the speech rights of the platforms versus the way in which the laws were impairing the speech of users by restricting content in ways that infringes on the speech rights of the users. And the way I see this being problematic going forward is in terms of AI regulation. So one of the things that many folks, including us at Lawyers Committee, have been advocating for is requiring that algorithmic decision-making systems be required to do pre and post deployment impact assessments in terms of, we want to require companies to test their systems for biases, for other forms of harm, and to look at what sorts of risk mitigations need to happen and to publish reports about their findings, maybe sanitized reports with trade secrets redacted or summaries or something like that. But the idea being, it's sort of like crash testing for cars, right? Or testing drugs before they're released on the market. We want these things to be tested. We want some disclosures. And the way in which the opinions were written in the Ninth Circuit calls into question the ability to do that, because they took this really cabined, narrow view of what forms of speech can be compelled from the platforms. And I'm not sure that some of the AI disclosure requirements would satisfy the narrow view of the Ninth Circuit. And that's what's very concerning to me about how we go forward here.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I hate to cut us off, but we are at time. So I just want to extend my heartfelt thanks to David, Alex, and Lee for a fantastic discussion. I wish we could stick around and discuss Murthy some more because we didn't quite, there's so much to discuss. So thank you for a great conversation about both the Ninth Circuit cases and that as well. And I'm delighted to introduce our next panel, which will address postmortems generally, researcher access to data, and oversight mechanisms to study the election. And to moderate that panel, I'm delighted to be joined by Rose Jackson. Rose Jackson is the director of the Democracy and Technology Initiative at the Atlantic Council Technology Program, where she runs the Digital Forensic Lab. She is an entrepreneur and former diplomat with nearly 2 decades of experience strengthening democracy and defending human rights, leveraging technology for social impact, and building institutions to support democratic activists around the world. She previously founded and served as chief executive officer of Beacon, a platform leveraging data and marketing technology to make it easier for people to take meaningful civic and political action. Prior to founding her company, Jackson served as a senior policy advisor at the Open Society Foundations, where she led a presidential transition initiative focused on reforming U.S. support to foreign military and police. During the Obama administration, Jackson served as the chief of staff to the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department, and before that as an advisor to Senator Chris Coons on foreign policy and national security as a Galloway Fellow. Thanks so much for moderating, Rose.
Thank you so much. And I am joined by an extremely exciting panel for this next conversation. And before we dive in, thank you to CDT for the invitation and to the panelists before me for a really interesting conversation. I think it's fitting that we wrap up with a discussion on researcher access to data and broader conversations on transparency, given that so much of a conversation about freedom of expression, and particularly freedom of expression on digital platforms, which are highly scaled and simultaneously quite bubbled in communication, how we know what we know, to even prioritize the questions that we want to ask, the policies that we want to drive forward, and the necessary steps to create a future world in which our digital expectations of rights and social cohesion can be met as much as we might expect in our physical spaces. I can think of no better panel than the one we're about to have a conversation with. So I'd like to first introduce Rebecca Trumbull, who is the director of George Washington University's Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. She serves on the advisory council of the European Digital Media Observatory, known as EDMO, through which she has led a good deal of the global conversations around data access in the context of the EU's Digital Services Act and GDPR before that. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining. We are also joined by Brandon Silverman, who is the former CEO and co-founder of CrowdTangle, which was a groundbreaking and I would say field-shaping social media data access platform that was acquired and unfortunately later shuttered by Meta. According to social media, Brandon is a fan of transparency and dogs, one of which he is able to do in part as a fellow at Rebecca's program at GW. We'll let you guys guess which one it is. And finally, we are rounded out by Agustina Del Campo, who is an Argentina-based human rights lawyer and professor at the Universidad de Palermo. She directs the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, and is a recognized global expert on questions around technology, expression, and human rights protections. She has also served as the vice chair of the Global Network Initiative. I'm really excited to dive in, and just to say, in our pre-conversations, it felt hard to stop our discussion. So I will do my best throughout this to keep that flowing. And I want to start with just to everyone, the question, given that we're maybe a decade into a pretty robust and professionalized conversation about understanding social media, coming to awareness of the ways in which social media can impact the world in very real ways. What do you think has changed about the conversation on data access? Are there things that we know how to do better? And are there some things that you think we're kind of in the same place on? Just what's the state of play today? And perhaps we'll start with Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Rose, and thanks to CDT for having me here, and of course my fellow panelists for joining in the discussion. It's a really good question. I was trying to very quickly think about where this discussion was about a decade ago within my own circles. I am first and foremost an academic researcher, right? An empirical social scientist. And I was just starting to wade into the water of studying digital political communication roughly about 10 years ago. And so if I kind of transport myself back into that time, I think most of the focus then was, well, what sort of questions should we be even asking in the first place, right? Everybody was just trying to grapple with the sense that here's a new set of communication platforms and systems that are clearly having big impacts on the way that we all communicate with one another and about big important issues. But, before that, everybody was sort of focused on these as being new flash in the pan things that may not fundamentally work into and transform our communication systems beyond that, right? There were slick things that young kids used for whatever. It was really only about a decade ago that I think we started grappling with the fact that social media was here to stay, and that it was really going to be a core part of fundamental communication, not just for the kids, right, but for everyone, and that would integrate with what we thought of as traditional mass media and so on. So roughly 10 years ago, we're still wrapping our heads around what this thing is and how we need to think about it in the first place. But then once we start taking that seriously, then we have to move to the question of what data do we need in order to address these questions? And 10 years ago, we were in a place where people are starting to think about, okay, computational social science, maybe that's a thing. Maybe we need to think about new ways of actually getting data. We need new tools for that. But some of the most impactful platforms had relatively open APIs, right, at the time. And so it was, in a sense, for those who could acquire the skills to conduct the research in that way, it was sort of a free-for-all, right? Go in and grab everything that you can. Since then, I think there have been hard conversations across a number of different fields and a number of different arenas about the responsible way to conduct this research, at the same time that we've seen those avenues for actually collecting the data really being shut down, right? The open APIs are no longer open. In some cases, they don't even exist anymore. And so just at the moment where I think we finally figured out what are the really big important things that we want to be asking, just at the moment when we've really realized that these are profound, that these platforms will have profound impacts on all of our lives from here and going forward, we're actually now in a position where we are much more in the dark than we were before, when we were still trying to wrap our heads around what we do with all of this.
Thanks. Brandon, can I go to you next? And given the flavor of the conference itself being on elections, the same question, but particularly in the context of elections, are we in a different place? Do we have new skills? Are we standing still? And mute buttons, we've now gotten our one out of the way. Thank you for doing that, Brandon.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think Rebecca echoed a lot of my feelings, which was, there was a lot more access to data 10 years ago, but it was also probably a terrible ecosystem of like ethics and privacy violations. And we've made a lot of progress on that front, while also then sacrificing access to a lot of the data we want, or putting it behind walls that are like much harder to get through, or in some cases just having them entirely shut down. And I think, when at our work in CrowdTangle, there's like no question that election work was one of our biggest components. And if we're looking in the very short term, like this year, 2024 and 2025, there's much less access to data for civil society groups in particular, especially journalists, but also academics to be able to monitor elections. And just to give two quick examples, there's obviously the CrowdTangle one, but I think if you also look at some of the voluntary efforts, Meta launched what was a really groundbreaking and huge effort to study the US 2020 election. And there's not only have no other platforms attempted anything similar, but Meta obviously isn't doing that for this election either. So we've lost both the short-term window into what's happening with the content, but also the more long-term studies. But to end on a slightly optimistic note, I do think that the answer to all these questions is crafting laws that require the sort of data we want. And we are making progress on that front, especially in Europe. There is still a lot of work to be done, and we need to combine that with other work across civil society. But I'm optimistic by 2025 and certainly by 2026 here in the US, some of that work will have kicked in and we'll begin to see the tide turn in a slightly different direction.
Thanks. And Agustina, the same question, but noting that we just started with 2 Americans operating in both platforms that tend to be headquartered in the United States, dealing with laws that have been the leading edge in Europe. As someone that has done quite a bit of work looking at the global community engaging in these spaces, what do you see as changing or the same in how we've been approaching questions of data access and understanding platforms?
Okay, so a slightly different take. I agree with what has been said, but I think there were key changes over the past decade and a half. One, technological changes, what platforms can do with the information that they have. The debate in 2014 over the ability of platforms to monitor its own content, for example, was radically different than the one we have today. So I think technology is dramatically different and may grant different kinds of access today than the ones they were able to grant maybe 10 or 15 years ago. The second part is, I think there's been a shift from a rights conversation to a risks conversation that's related to the internet. So when we're thinking about transparency and access to data, the goal that we're trying to achieve through transparency or through access to data, I think has also changed. We're not looking necessarily at transparency from a rights perspective, but we're looking at it from a risks perspective. And the clearest example that I can think of is the first exercises of transparency that companies did looking at state access to data and state requests to remove content and the focus on that kind of transparency versus the kinds of transparency that we're now talking about, which for good or evil have nothing to do with that. In fact, we have shifted our attention a little bit from what the state is doing, and we're focusing a little bit more on risks rather than rights. The third change that I see very profoundly in the fact that I see as a constant maybe in the past decade is somewhat of an inability from civil society, but also from researchers and even from states in clearly determining what we mean by the transparency that we need. What is transparency? Transparency for what? The transparency we need for accountability is probably not the same that we need from a sociological perspective for policy input, for example, to understand how discrimination in society works. Well, that's really interesting kind of research, but it's probably a different data set than the one you need for platform accountability, for example, or for state accountability for that matter. And it gets accentuated, I think, when we're talking about elections or the election framework.
That's really helpful to bring in the question of actors and what is it that we're trying to achieve. Even just the term data access was an attempt by many to get slightly more precise in the grand vision of quote unquote transparency. But I'm curious, all of you have been involved in the now many-year experiment that is the Digital Services Act. And one significant component of the DSA that people are excited about is really taking on some of these meatier questions of defining what we mean. What kind of data access, to whom, by whom? How do you determine who is trustworthy enough to have access to more sensitive information? What information should be available to the broader public? And frankly, to your point, Augustina, what questions should we be attempting to answer through that access and information? I'm curious if I can start with you, Rebecca. Are you seeing promising trends, or are there things in that process that has come up for you as surprisingly harder to do than you thought? And I'll give you the opportunity to also say things that you think are actually easier than people believe, not to say that any of this is easy. But we're in the middle of this world-changing experiment, and a lot of countries are watching it and trying to figure out where they fit into it. So I would love to hear your insight, having gone through so much of it.
Yeah. What I think is really interesting about the approach that the Digital Services Act takes, and specifically Article 40 of the DSA, which is focused on researcher data access, is that it embeds, and really the whole DSA, right, really looks at this, as Augustina was commenting, from a risk-based approach, but it's assessing risks in service of better understanding where there might be violations of fundamental human rights for European users of the platforms, and how those sorts of risks that could represent risks to those rights could in fact be mitigated. Full Article 40 on researcher data access is not yet in effect. There are two different components of this. Article 40.12, which is really focused on access to real-time data, has been in effect for more than a year now. And we're seeing, I think, it's fair to say, mixed results with that. On the optimistic side, and the thing that I honestly am feeling really good about, is the fact that almost every single one of the very large online platforms and search engines that were required to actually set up researcher data access programs under 40.12, at least almost all of them at least have somewhere on their website that says, why, yes, researchers can request access to our data. Now, in practice, what does that mean? We don't know, right? Some of the platforms, those who have been doing a bit more data access in previous years, have slightly more robust systems. None of them are perfect by any means. But a lot of them, it isn't anything more than just this little statement on the website that says, sure, researchers can have access to data. The platforms are reasonably complaining that the European Commission has not provided more guidance about what this means. I'm hopeful that in the weeks ahead, we'll actually be seeing some more on that. But in the meantime, we're left with a status quo where the platforms themselves are laying out the rules of the road for what it means to review and approve who qualifies as a researcher, what data will they actually give access to, what research projects, right, will they approve. And this is a situation that I think really is in nobody's benefit to continue. And even for the platforms, right, the more that they are reviewing and sort of have their hands in the processes to make decisions about who gets access to what data, the more legal liability they have under a number of different provisions, including GDPR in Europe. And so I'm relatively optimistic that we'll make some progress in the next few months over laying out a more robust system that will help platforms take a step back, give researchers more power over these processes themselves, but we're just not there yet. And frankly, for 40.12 and the provisions that haven't gone into effect, which all deal with bespoke requests to the new digital services coordinators rather than the platforms for private data, not just public data, real-time data, as in 40.12, we don't even have a delegated act from the European Commission yet. So we have nothing but really a lot of question marks at this point. And this work is going to be really, really, really hard. Even after those questions are answered, I always tell researchers in this space that we've got to have patience, because it's going to be a very bumpy road for at least the first year to 18 months before we start to see a system that's functioning very well. And that's very clearly evidenced by how things have been going with 40.12.
That's really helpful. And I've been thinking about every time there's a little bit of a release of some aspect, right? There are transparency reports that are part of voluntary codes. There's kind of the initial playing with what you referenced, a year of open access being required in so many different forms. As people are testing, we're certainly learning some of the good, bad, and ugly of different approaches. Augustina, I'm curious, there's a pretty significant conversation in the global community about what does the DSA do for the world? Whether that's a conversation about just setting a standard and getting a standard right that others attempt to engage with or mimic, or it's actually a question of who is gaining access to this information to understand a systemic internet and systemic information space. I'm curious, as you've been watching how the DSA has been developing, are there things that you would want to flag as particularly promising or problematic from that viewpoint?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We've been following the DSA since its drafting, and Article 40 with a lot of interest. Last year, we organized a couple of meetings with Global South. I hate that term, but I'm going to use it because it's clear what I mean. But we did organize a couple of meetings to see how researchers and civil society were thinking about this. And we came out with not a lot, but a few clear points. One is that we're all very cautiously optimistic that the DSA may provide access to data that has not been available so far. So there's a number of transparency obligations that are going to be interesting for the global ecosystem, and that's definitely going to be beyond Europe. But maybe the most significant part of Article 40, which is the regulatory dialogue that the Commission seems to be pushing for, it's not yet clear how they are going to engage with the rest of the world. It seems to be, for one, a very European-focused kind of legislation. So it's not clear how they are going to value the input from research elsewhere and what that means for the European ecosystem. They have not been very integrative of foreign views in their conversations so far. They have engaged with the US a lot more than they did with other communities, the Latin American community, the African community, the Asian community. I think there are problems there in terms of whether they are gonna be contributing to researchers outside of Europe and the United States accessing information from platforms. The second thing is the scope is limited. The scope that the DSA has is based on their systemic risks definition. So one of the concerns that I have is that in looking at the DSA, I understand that maybe in their opinion, those are the biggest systemic risks. There's a big part, which is the state that is out of the DSA equation. The DSA does not consider the state to be a systemic risk. And unfortunately, in most countries all over the world, the state is the main threat to human rights out there. So it's at least incomplete, and it probably could foster a very siloed view of the risks, particularly to elections, which is the topic of our conversation today, right? If we don't place elections in platforms in a broader context of elections in elections, how is social media, how is the internet playing out with journalism, with political parties, with campaigning, in Argentina, we have offline disinformation, people submitting fake ballots that are left underneath your doors. So those things are still there. And I'm not sure the DSA has a lot to offer so long as they view the systemic risks from the narrow perspective of the platform. And then again, it's not clear how they're going to be dealing with foreign researchers.
It's a really interesting set of points, and I think builds on what you had pointed out before, right? This pendulum sometimes between focusing on containing or understanding the power of a government actor as opposed to understanding or containing the power of a commercial or industry actor, where in reality, these are kind of spaces that we're all playing on, not necessarily in competition with each other. Rebecca, I know you wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, just a really quick couple of points to underscore some things that Augustina was saying, really put a fine point on them. Right now, the language in the DSA is not clear about really who can receive access. There is the possibility that non-European based researchers would be able to have access to data under the DSA, but that seems like it's going to hinge on a sort of particular wonky understanding and interpretation of a separate law, the European Copyright Law, the European Copyright Act. And then crucially, while Augustina, you are so right to emphasize the sort of big gap in the DSA's perspective of focusing on state actors, potential threats to rights that are coming from state actors. The one area where the DSA does take this seriously is threats from external state actors. And so while we have this, it's sort of interesting to see that we've got this odd juxtaposition where we don't know for sure whether other researchers could be brought in to support understanding, get access to the data to help us understand these particular risks. But in fact, those are the one area where the law is focused on potential state-based risks.
It's such I feel like any conversation on the internet, you have to say 12 times over that the internet does not respect your boundaries. And it is this tricky bit. We were having a conversation before about the first transparency reports requiring all of the covered companies to disclose the language capacities that they have for content moderation in European official languages. And that report dropped the same week that the conflict between Israel and Gaza started. And I think it was X that just happened to include every single language that anyone in the company could speak. And so it included Arabic and Hebrew, which of course brought to the fore how relevant that capacity is, even though it's not an official European language. And so thinking about those sorts of questions expanded and expanded and expanded. Even if you were only focused on foreign actors in a European context, certainly you would benefit from an Argentinian researcher understanding Argentinian actors in their own spaces. I'm so glad that you called that out. I think I'm curious, Brandon, if we can throw it to you at the very practical level. You've had to actually figure out yourself some of these questions in the absence of regulation and rules while you were building a platform that had to have policies around who could gain access to that data, what kind of data, what data did you prioritize and for what reasons, how did that create dynamics within a company about what could be known. I'm curious now that you're pretty intimately involved in the questions around data access and transparency in the DSA implementation. Excuse me, are there things you think that they're really getting right things that seem like they might be missing. And I guess just to say, like, if you're a king for the day, pardon the reference point, at an elections event, but we'll go with it. What would you really want to be able to make sure they nail and how they implement this in the DSA?
All right. I will try and keep this brief. I can probably go on for a while. But so first, I will say that like I've been blown away by the staff at the commission level who've been working on this and the degree to which they have like really feel like they understand all of the trade-offs, the technical details, everything. This is like a very complicated space. But so I've just been like very impressed with the people who are working on this at the ground level. And I think one of the most important things that I think they feel very aligned on, which is something I've like come to believe really strongly in, is that for all this data access, we need some sort of overall regime that is about different tiers, that there are some data sets that should have incredibly strict, difficult to get through, access provisions. And there are other ones that represent less risky stuff, but provide more value to broader audiences. And we need to find ways to have a different tiers of system. And I feel like that's something they're very aligned on and are trying to bring into practice. And I think they're just kind of knocking it on the park when it comes to that. But I'd say going forward, I think there's three things I'm mostly looking for. So the first is obviously the Delegated Act and/or any additional guidance that comes from the commission on how they interpret and see Article 40.12. And by the way, I'm going to focus on 40.12 because that's much more an area I know relative to Rebecca and Augustine and others.
Can you remind everyone what 40.12
Yeah,
is?
40.12 is the one provision that is about real-time access to public data. And so it's much more in line with the sort of work we did at CrowdTangle, and is an area I feel a lot more like I know more of the nuances on. So one is that does not fall under the purview of Delegated Act. And so a lot of us are kind of hoping that in some different format, the commission can come out with more guidance as to how they see Article 40.112 and what compliance looks like, even if it's not a formal mechanism similar to the Delegated Act. And so can they spell out things like this is a broader audience of researchers should be able to use this provision relative to other ones, et cetera. So I think one is more guidance on how they interpret 40.12. A second one is I think this entire space, especially for those of us who care about making this access available internationally, is in desperate need of standards at the global level. And I think the commission could play a really important role if they decide to support efforts to build standards. And I think they already have to some degree with a lot of the work they've done around some of the stuff Rebecca has been leading on for the last several years around an intermediary body. But I think there's a big question of like, not only can we begin to set a precedent for what the laws look like, but can we begin to establish global standards for this so that countries all over the world can begin following suit, and also can we unlock some of the jurisdictional like stuff that gets really complicated. And then the last one is I do think there's definitely a risk of a little bit of field of dreams of like just hoping if you build it they'll come, like just providing data, and even if the platforms get all the data access 100% right, you were talking about a field that is technically challenging. There are not a lot of practitioners who've been doing this for 50 years with these like petabytes of data, et cetera. And one of the things we need is money to help support the research community to both be able to do the research itself, but similar to where I've also spent a lot of time, is to build the tools that make the data useful. And simply having a massive Google Cloud storage full of 150 petabytes of data is not going to help an election monitoring group in the global South, or even in places in Europe, if they can't turn that data into useful insights. And that requires real work. And so I think the other one I'm looking for is, can the commission find ways to support some of this stuff financially as well?
That's great. And I want to make sure we come back to questions of the research community.
Oh, sorry. By the way, one small thing. I forgot to also flag on the standards front. One of the other signs of progress here is the US and the White House is also beginning to like show some support for this. So there was an announcement a few weeks ago that the NTIA and I think the OSTP at the White House are actually already in the process of beginning to build out their guidelines around researcher access and standards, which is a huge step forward.
That is a significant step forward and connected to the conversations happening in Europe and elsewhere. Augustina, did you want to add something?
Yeah, just very quickly to put my plus 1,000 to Brandon on that last comment. The inequalities, the existing inequalities in the amount of research on the information ecosystem between Global South and Global North is huge. The lack of research that is pervasive when it's outside of Europe and the United States, it's really frustrating. And when thinking about who's going to be considered a researcher for these purposes, what tools are there going to be available? I think that needs to be a lot of a broader conversation than it is today, and should take into account precisely that it's not a question of building it and they will come. It doesn't work like that. There needs to be active work so that there's meaningful engagement.
Such an important point. And I think often people in a conversation about technology forget about people and policy and think that these are just technical streams, or that if you just have the data, it's fine. And so I before the end of this, I really do want to make sure that we're able to talk about some of the dynamics shaping the broader research community globally and in the United States and Europe. But before we do that, you raised something really important also, Agustina, which is the learnings from each other, right? It's not just a question of having the global majority able to do research because that's a neutral good on its own. It's an interconnected internet. We all actually need that. And no bigger proof point actually than the talk about this year has been that it was the super year of elections, right? 80 something elections around the world, more people voting this year than ever before in the history of the world, at the same moment that democracies are in decline for the first time over the course of many years since the 1980s. And given that dynamic, there was a lot of conversation in particular about whether AI was going to be a fundamental change, whether the kind of spate of elections would mean platforms were less capable of engaging as they would in other places as responsibly. And I'm curious, we're now more than halfway through. We're gearing up towards a big one in the United States, but a lot of the very large elections in India and elsewhere have already happened. And I'm curious if you can speak to what we've learned, and if there's anything from that that should filter into what we do and do not need to know in the context of these data access conversations, in particular to keep elections safe and transparent and to learn from them. I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand to go first, or I will be a jerk and just call on you. We'll go back to Brandon first.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I do think it is worth highlighting some of what's happening here in the US around attacks on researchers and the degree to which that is having a huge impact on the ability for academic and civil society to help participate in them. And I mean, I'll admit a segue to something Rebecca's launching, which I think is really important. But again, it points to the fact that this is a socio-technical, this is a cross-society-wide challenge, and we need to be thinking about strategies for data access, funding, research for institutions, funding, support for researchers, et cetera. But it's had an absolutely stifling effect on being able to monitor elections here in the US and just the sheer number of people who are doing it. And by the way, I think one very small misinterpretation of some of that work, which is probably intentional on the part of some of the people who've been launching the campaigns against researchers, is that while it's true some of them were in contact with platforms, et cetera, the vast majority of work that researchers do when it's monitoring elections is helping inform journalists and the news industry about how to cover the elections and what stories they should be trying to help cover more so that citizens have a complete picture of the issues. And so for me, that feels just like such a core, like, and I hope non-controversial value for like how to run a liberal democracy is having a marketplace of ideas where people can engage and debate with them. And that a big part of what this work all does is help support that.
Thank you. Suppose I should throw it to Rebecca for that nicely teased news from Brandon.
Thank you, Brandon, for the setup. Thank you, Rose. To take just a quick step back, right, to the original question about what we're looking at in the overall landscape in terms of monitoring and conducting research to understand what's happening during this really pivotal election year. Now we're rightly focused, first and foremost, especially for those of us in the US, on the upcoming presidential election. We're roughly 6 weeks away from that. This is a really important moment. But this has been a crucial moment globally for elections. We're more than halfway done, and there have been a number of really important elections that have happened internationally. And there's been this sort of buildup of different factors that I think have created this point in time in 2024 where this absolutely vital public interest work has been no more difficult, has become more difficult than at any other time before. So, you know, we've had first the sort of undermining of a number of key trust and safety tasks, workers, remits, a number who have been laid off across a number of different platforms. And there, right, it's not that trust and safety workers have been essential for researcher interactions, although some external independent researchers have in fact interfaced with those trust and safety workers, but they were vital for performing the key tasks and then communicating out with the public what it was they were seeing happening inside the platforms at any given moment. And that sort of work is just much, much harder to achieve. We're not hearing from the platforms themselves nearly as much anymore about what they're seeing during these crucial election periods. Second is that the data access itself, so the ability for independent external eyes to check on these things, to monitor these things, has really been hampered because APIs and tools like CrowdTangle have been shut down. But then third is, and I really can't underscore this enough, the pressure that researchers themselves are facing from external actors who are doing things like filing lawsuits or issuing letters of inquiry and subpoenas, who are, you know, working with online sort of confederates to bring together these you know, effectively dog piles of attacks that then get further media attention, trying to undermine this work that's being done. And there are a number of different accusations that are being lodged at independent researchers. You know, I fundamentally believe that they are all completely and utterly baseless. But what we're seeing is that the researchers are, you know, committed to doing this work, and so are really working hard to keep it going even under this absolutely incredible pressure. Folks aren't caving, but the day in and day out work is just much, much harder. And fundamentally, I see this as part of a larger campaign, a larger initiative to undermine in the public's eyes, to undermine higher education and science and scientific inquiry, right? The knowledge that scientific experts are bringing to the table, are bringing to journalists, are bringing to the public. And fundamentally, it's a right of, right, those of us who do this work to share. It's a right to share our perspectives with the public. And we're seeing political actors trying to undermine our right and our ability to do this work. And so on Friday, by a bit of coincidence, I am launching a new initiative called the Researcher Support Consortium at a public event here at GW. If anyone's in the audience and would like to join us at 2 p.m., you are very welcome. But what's really important here is that we've put together a series of resources and tools for researchers' institutions to stand up and support those who are doing this important public interest work. There just isn't a whole lot of understanding that, first and foremost, this is an occupational hazard for researchers. There isn't a lot of focus on their fundamental rights to do this work. And so the Researcher Support Consortium is there to try to work directly with institutions, particularly professional associations and universities, to get them to take the steps that are absolutely essential to protecting this important public interest work.
Thank you so much for sharing that and laying that out so clearly, Rebecca. And I'm reminded, the Digital Forensic Research Lab is composed of researchers all around the world. And the running joke for us, as we've come under some of those same pressures that you discussed here in the United States, is that for most of our international researchers, there's a little bit of a welcome. now you know what we experience. But underscoring yet again that there is no such thing as separate internets and separate experiences. And the more that people understand the scope of the very intentional and coordinated attacks to frustrate the ability of independent researchers to help us understand our own information ecosystems, to be able to build the rules and laws and societal guidelines that we would like, whatever those are, the more important that conversation and awareness is. So thank you for doing that, and encourage people to take a look on Friday. I'm cognizant that we're just about over time here. So what I want to do is let each of our panelists give their last thoughts before I turn it over to close. And let's start with Augustina.
Well, thanks. Congratulations, Rebecca, on this initiative. It's very timely. So thanks for putting that together. I'm going to address the last question, and I think it sort of recaps what I've been trying to put forth here. I think a couple of things have gotten worse or accentuated during this big electoral year. For one, there's been a lot of reforms in different countries giving states or state officials powers to act during the election with no transparency regarding what they are asking platforms to do, what kind of access to data they are requesting, and that's getting problematic, and that affects researchers as well and journalists, and it creates tension around their work. A second thing is an increasing trend in stigmatization of journalists, particularly during investigative journalism, and the stigmatization campaigns that we're seeing in different countries popping up are huge. Slaps are growing in numbers, and they are growing in attention.
Remind people what slaps are.
Slaps are lawsuits that are launched basically to silence journalists, defenders, organizations, researchers. It's a way of persecuting people through legal means. It's an abuse of legal tools that are out there towards other ends, but are used to censor speech, basically. And those are increasing after 2 or 3 decades of working on these. Instead of decreasing, they are increasing. Attacks on journalists are increasing instead of decreasing. And the mechanisms and protocols to address those are not there. There's huge levels of impunity across the globe. This index is not improving. It's getting worse. So anything we can do to put some light on the overall situation is very welcome. And thanks again for having me on this panel.
Thank you, Augustina. Brandon, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think I'm going to make the world's worst pitch for more people to come work on transparency and data access, which is, there's a definition of transparency as a banal policy idea, which is it's like pervasive and uncontroversial. But I think the truth is, having been in this space on the policy side for the last year and a half, 2 years, we're just kind of I think we need more people working on it. And it is partly because it is banal. And I think there are theories of change out there where you can take advantage of huge moments to do big things in short periods of time. But at least personally, I think that more sustained and impactful change happens with like slow, boring, methodical, hard work over long periods of time. And I think that is the sort of change that we're trying to pursue on the data access side. And so it's not going to get front page articles. Well, maybe if you shut down a transparency program, it might. But most of the time, it's
no
not.
idea what you're talking about, Brandon.
Yeah. But there are hard, technical, challenging, cross-industry things that just have to be worked through. But my hope is that when you get there, it's the sort of change that can last for a very long time and impact a lot of the issues we care about. And so that's my pitch for folks who care about a lot of these internet-related things, that data access is, I hope, one of the ways we can achieve a long-term vision of the internet we want, but we also need more help. So.
That's excellent. And Rebecca?
2 very quick calls to action. One for the non-research community is simply to recognize and find ways to support researchers who are doing this vital work. We continue to do it because this is a group of people who are committed to the greater good, to the public interest. And this community deserves the support and protection of others in this space, whether that's lawyers, whether that's administrators, whether that's the general public, right? Reaching out and saying to people how great and important we think your work is. Every little piece helps to bolster the resolve of folks around the world who are doing this work. The second is to the research community. We're looking in the upcoming months of what could be a real transformation in the data access landscape as Article 40 of the DSA comes fully into effect. But it won't operate well unless we cooperate with one another and the institutions that are working to try to make sense of this, including a new independent intermediary body that will be established and announced relatively soon. But the key is that we need to cooperate and work together and try and push back against those individual incentives that we have to go after our own things, our own pursuits, including our own data sets. Because if we do that, all run for the shiny object at the same time, we're going to overwhelm the system and ultimately no one's going to benefit. So even to the researchers, remember why we do this work, the fundamental good that we're trying to serve, and remember that then incentivizes us to work together in order to try and turn this into a sensible and workable system.
Excellent. And with that, just to say thank you to the panelists for giving of your time, to CDT, to giving of your virtual stage. And I'm now going to pass to Kate Moran, who is the director of the Free Expression Project at CDT, I believe, to close you out. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, everybody. Thank you, Rose, Rebecca, Brandon, and Augustina, for such a fascinating and essential conversation. And on behalf of the Center for Democracy and Technology and Stand Together Trust, thank you all so much for joining us for this year's Future Speech Online. We will see you soon. Thank you all.